Welcome to the One Puff Media Podcast, brought to you by The High Index, bringing you real conversations with people shaping the future of cannabis. Join us weekly to go behind the scenes of tech and innovation powering the plant. Come roll with us.
Hey, welcome to this episode of One Puff Media. How's everyone doing today? James, how are you, sir?
Good, Alex. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. Our guest today is Seth Yakatan.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us today and joining us for a convo. And for everyone who's watching, listening, tuning in, Seth, why don't you kind of break down who you are, who you're with, and what you're all about in the industry?
Thank you. Who am I? I'm a human that tends to breathe oxygen. That's my preferred, modality. I'm kidding. And you guys, this is going to be a long day if you're not going to laugh at my jokes, guys. I'm kidding. You could throw tomatoes. I say I'm just a dumb corporate finance guy. I've been in the rec cannabis space now since about 2018. I've been very fortunate to have two very large enterprise engagements where I've done M&A and corporate finance at Ease and Class House. It's given me the ability to do a lot of things in a lot of other states. I have a capital markets consulting firm that I've had for about 25 years called Caton Associates in cannabis. Last year, I started an operational consulting firm for cannabis companies called Ordo Verde with two partners where we go in and do kind of evaluation of cultivation, manufacturing, brand, and retail. I've had a couple pretty interesting engagements there. I've got this minuscule LinkedIn presence that I've somehow cultivated, and I guess I've become somewhat of a pundit or voice, and just been able to try and build a lot of authentic relationships with people, and just really grateful for the acceptance, I guess, that I've received. So having a lot of fun.
Awesome.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's great. So your journey from traditional banking into biotech to cannabis, is that kind of what led to Yakatan Associates? Were you looking to fill any specific gaps?
Honestly, I wasn't. My story always talks about my father. My dad was a really successful entrepreneur in life sciences who grew up in an orphanage and started a couple of effectively like supply companies, consumable supply companies, and sold them. And, when I was 17 to 27, I didn't want to be in the same galaxy as my dad. I wanted to be able to do everything myself. I did, and I got into a fairly successful career on the institutional buy side of capital. And I found it to be unfulfilling for me. You get to a point in that industry or in Wall Street where you can run an 8-minute mile and you try to run a 7 and 45 mile and they're like, well, slow down. Keep it like 8:03, bro. You don't need to be out there. Keep it 8:03. And like the politics and all of that, I just couldn't deal. In 2001, my dad was consulting for a bunch of venture funds and a bunch of companies, and I just took this amazing stupid at that point leap of faith to leave a several hundred, 6-7 digit a year institutional job and start a consulting firm with him focused on emerging growth life sciences companies in 2001. James, you look like you might be old enough to remember that 2001 was in the middle of a recession, so it was a very interesting choice. I had no aspirations to get into cannabis, to be quite honest with you, especially in the early days. A lot of what I have done in my life is reverse mergers, taking either a company that can't get any money or a crappy company that someone's stuck in and figuring out a way to get liquidity from it. And when I saw the evolution of the industry and the proliferation of reverse mergers that occurred in Canada with like the Canopies and the Auroras and all of the Canadian companies, I said, this is just whatever is like soup du jour. This is never going to be a real industry. This is never going to work. I can make money, trying to sell air to pharmaceutical companies, and I'm just going to stay doing that. That took a pretty hard right turn in 2012. And it took a pretty hard right turn in 2018 again. So in 2012, I started a therapeutic drug development company that was focused on cannabinoids and spent several years doing that. And then 2018-19, I kept bumping into this thing called Ease in LA, and I just got sucked in. So
what is Ease, if you don't mind?
Ease, I still believe, is the largest delivery platform for cannabis in the world. Ease had built a non-storefront dispensary in California that served 70% of the state. So you go on your app, you go on your phone, you go to the website, you go to their app, and they'll deliver cannabis to your door in an hour or less.
Was this for
So-
medical or for rec?
Rec.
Rec,
Just for
okay.
rec. And at the end of that kind of iteration, I think I was at Ease for 2.5 years. The end of that iteration, myself and the guy who's now the CEO orchestrated a merger where we turned Ease into like the 16th largest private MSO in the United States, bought assets in Florida and Michigan and Colorado. So
Congrats.
subsequently subsequently that whole thing went bankrupt and ass over tea kettle and a whole series of not good things. But yeah, it was fun while it lasted.
I feel like everything in the cannabis industry is great until it's not, right? I mean, with everything shifting just from market to market, you never know what's going to happen, especially as you're transitioning from the West Coast to an East Coast market and trying to expand. It's just apples to oranges, securing the licenses, as you know, and it's just a wild ride.
It's life. It seems like it's exponentially exacerbated in cannabis because of the complexity of it. But yeah, I mean, I would say, Alex, that I don't know that it's every company would say that because of the because of the constraints that are put on our industry specifically, the state-to-state variability, the 280E taxation, the inequity and imbalance as it relates to who can attract capital and the scarcity of capital, those four things create a difficult environment. And I think they're more difficult in our industry than any other industry I've ever been involved with. And because of that, I think two things significantly upregulate in cannabis that don't upregulate in other industries is that there's a large amount of debt capital that is provided to the industry, more so than in any other industry I've ever been in, just because that seems to be the form of currency that investors are willing to invest in. And as a result of that, you provide companies with an obligation that they might not otherwise have. You don't have a bankruptcy function in cannabis. So in most normal other businesses, those creditors would bankrupt companies. You can't do that in cannabis. So it creates stories and it creates the proliferation of what I call zombies. So like the traditional tools that are available to either an investor or an entrepreneur in terms of, you go into the tool chest and there's 14 tools. Well, there's like a screwdriver in cannabis. Like that's it. So I think what you've seen is that the form of capital that's available, not a lot of adult supervision, and the fact that remedy is like receivership. We could go through all the companies that have failed. I think largely it's because the form of capital that they've had been forced to take. And the other thing, and I'll stop here, is that a lot of businesses in cannabis are collections of assets that have been compiled for an exit. So if we just look at one thing that's in the news right now, an AYR. AYR was a financial vehicle where some guy who's allegedly, some guy like me, some real smart guy, who didn't know anything about the industry, said, hey, let's put all these things together because if we put them together, it's going to work. And then some dumb, big other pile of money is going to come along and buy us. Well, if you put $500 million of debt on it and you don't get the exit, you got $500 million of debt.
Right.
So the other thing in cannabis that seems to proliferate in a way that doesn't proliferate in a lot of other industries is you have a lot of businesses that are just kind of like collections of assets and they're not really integrated businesses. And I think that also kind of exacerbates the pain or the consternation that we see in some of these deals.
Why do you think that is in the cannabis industry? That's so prevalent, just a collection of companies, collection of assets versus other industries outside cannabis?
I don't know, James. I wish I had an answer to that question. I was at dinner tonight with the guy who's a senior executive last night of, one of the larger cannabis companies in the United States. He's in 26 states. And he basically said to me, I've inherited a collection of assets. I don't have a business. I think part of it is because in the early stage of an industry like this, if you're lucky enough to get one of the lottery tickets where you've got a bolus of capital, I think a lot of the strategy is just grab as much stuff as you can and we'll figure it out, as opposed to discipline. I don't know that I have a better answer than that.
Do you think maybe it has something to do with the amount of licenses that are being applied for, secured by folks that probably only have the intent of wanting to sell those licenses and never develop a business?
That's part of it. But, you know, if you look at the pressure that was put on the industry from 2014 to 2016 from the IPO craze
Mm-hmm.
or the RTO craze, you had a lot of money that was chasing a limited number of assets. So if the three of us are in a company and, you know, there's two other guys that have raised $100 million and we're trying to buy stuff, we're going to just buy stuff, right? So like you get caught up in that. I think that has one thing to do with it. I don't know.
It's interesting. I see a lot of similarities with the tech boom. You know, a lot of early tech companies, especially as they began to scale, they would buy up all the other smaller tech companies around them that were either filling a gap of the technologies they couldn't provide or something that they could do better with and enhance their own products. And then what ended up happening is you had companies that would buy up 10, 15 other small companies and then ultimately get purchased by some VC in New York, some VC on the West Coast that's like, hey, I don't know anything about tech, but I see all these assets under this one umbrella. Let's buy it all and we're going to make this conglomerate and then we're going to get our exit and we're going to do our 10x on it. And I saw that firsthand with a company called Acela, which ironically now is running the cannabis applications in a lot of states for the government. And we were one of the acquisitions by that company. And so I got to see it firsthand. We were one of, I think, 8 acquisitions within a 2-year time period. We considered it more of a merger, but we sold off the company to them. And then within just a few years after that, the CEO was removed. VC in New York bought the company. And then they had all these assets that didn't really fit with the original model. Now, what are you going to do with it, right? You have all these different pieces of tech. Most of them were ended up being sunsetted or sold off to another company. And it just becomes a VC's, you know, portfolio. And so I see a lot of that in cannabis because especially with these new markets coming on, like James, what you were saying about the applications and Seth, what you kind of echoed about the, you know, us three just sitting around, let's just go buy everything. I think there's that just capitalistic mentality of most people in America. Let's just buy everything.
But here's the problem in cannabis, right? And you said it twice in your comments. And then some big dumb thing is going to buy us, right? Well, guess what? The big dumb thing to buy the cannabis guys in private equity and venture capital and CPG and BevAlc and wellness and, you know, confection, they haven't shown up. Right? So what you're left with a bunch of shit that hasn't been integrated, that has way too much debt that you can't bankrupt, and there's 25 of them, and I could elucidate, you know, more, right? So the fallacy that's existed in cannabis, you know, like that strategy has worked in American corporate finance capital markets for 80 years in a bunch of different industries. It doesn't work yet in cannabis because you don't have the exit. So what you're left is too much debt, not enough adult supervision, a bunch of shit that doesn't fit together. And what do we do? Right?
Why is bankruptcy not an option in cannabis?
Because cannabis is federally illegal. And in order to get federal bankruptcy protection, you have to have a industry which is federally legal.
Okay. Did not know that.
So let's just say we were in the pencil business, okay? And let's use AYR as an example. AYR is $500 million of revenue and $500 million of debt. What's going to happen to AYR is going to be clipped off for pieces, and those pieces are going to go to service as much of the debt as it possibly can. If we were in a bankruptcy situation, that $500 million would come in and take over the company and equitize it, forgive some of its debt, and figure out a way to pay itself off over time. That fundamental bankruptcy protection, which essentially I think is one of the reasons that most private credit functions, right? You have an asset, you can securitize it. If you as the entrepreneur mess up, I'm going to come in, I'm going to take that asset and I'm going to own it. I can't do that in cannabis. So you're left with this like dance where most of the people that raise the money and put the money in, they don't want to fucking, am I allowed to swear? They don't want to fucking, they don't want to operate these companies. Right? Chicago Atlantic, which is the single largest investor in cannabis, does not want to operate companies. Okay. That's not their job. Their job is to put on suits and make returns for their investors.
Buy and sell.
So buy and sell and get yield. So you're left with this very strange kind of dysfunctionality in the industry. And I don't know. I don't know if there's a solution for it other than some kind of federal change, you know, honestly.
I think it was interesting that the bill, I think it was proposed, either this past weekend or last week, that would essentially open up interstate commerce for some smaller companies. Now, there's no way it's going to pass, even though, it was a bipartisan proposed bill. I don't think that it's it has enough momentum yet to pass. Not only that, I think half the industry is divided, whether that would be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what side you fall on. Interstate commerce, who knows in this industry. So, Seth, let me ask you, with everything going on, capital strategy, and all the investment trends right now, and I guess to kind of further, the conversation, what do you think is what kind of cannabis companies are still investable in this market?
It's a great question. I think I post a lot about things that I think are working. When I say working, I apologize. I don't know how to get rid of that, but that'll be fun. I say generating revenue and either break even or cash flow positive. And I think that there are several models that work. I think we've seen the proliferation, and I'm going to do a post on this soon, of non-MSO brands, usually in vape or gummy or pre-roll work. So just to talk about category leaders, if you look at, Wild and Groon, and you look at Jeter and Natura, and you look at, Rove and Timeless, those are kind of business models where they're either asset light or inverse asset light that function, and companies that have been able to raise capital and I know are profitable, right? So in the proliferation of the non-MSO brand world, I think you probably have, I've found 30 companies that I think function pretty well. So that's one area that I think is investable. I think that there is a proliferation of second and third tier, typically private, either single state vertically integrated operators or multi-state vertically integrated operators. So like I call them baby MSOs that have been able to raise reasonable amounts, not too much, not too little, reasonable amounts of capital and been successful. You have a group of kind of 8 or 9 in the Midwest, in Missouri, Illicit, Elevate Cannabis, Greenlight. Yeah, I'm missing a few, but my guys at Blue Sage, a few more there. You have the guys at Standard Wellness and Derek Ross at Nova Farms and Anchor at C3. You've got a couple people in what I would call the Midwest and Northeast that have built 1 to 5 state, entities that kind of all are between like 50 and 130 million in revenue and are functioning pretty well.
Those are my favorite kinds of companies, by the way. Those are my favorite types. I love Standard Wellness. I think about Galenas as well, another small. I think they're operating in Ohio and Michigan, but absolutely love their product and their brand.
I want to give a shout to my guy, Jabron Washington at Ethos. He's ripping it in Philadelphia, ripping it. So you've got in that. I think there's one more, and I think that there are 2 operators in the state of California that are retail only. One in Embark and another in a group called, and I have to give them props, is Catalyst. Have a model where they are just doing retail, and I know both of those businesses function, right? I don't know outside of California that there's a tremendous amount of long-term value in just owning retail. But to answer your question, those are 3 very specific business models where in the course of 7 minutes or less, we've articulated 20 companies that function. There's 100 of them, right? There's another 80 that I haven't even talked about. That's what I think is interesting. That's where I spend a lot of my time. Those are the people that I try and develop my relationships with, because I think when the real wave, we've talked about the first wave, we talked about the second wave, when the real wave of cannabis comes, when all this dumb money finally comes in, those are the companies that are going to be bought, that are going to be buying, or going to be rolled, or going to roll. And that's where I'm spending my time developing my most important relationships.
What do you think about like the white labeling line of business? I think it's interesting, especially in the Northeast, you see so many brands coming out. Fernway is a perfect example. Love the brand. I think it's phenomenal. And there's so many like it that don't actually produce anything, but instead are just buying products, putting their own label on it, marketing it, and then getting it in retail. Is that like a real viable business as the industry scales?
I think it is. To go back to your last question, Fernway is a company that is in that cohort of functioning that I didn't mention. There's another group that I think manufactures a little bit more than they do. They're out west called Plug Play that has a Stizzy-like-esque device. It's a little bit longer, but people go crazy for that product. I do think that pure co-man as a model is challenging only because I think you're going to eventually get margin compressed. I think if you are white labeling because manufacturing or cultivation is your fundamental basis of existence, I think that's a better way to go about it. I think building a brand, where you're buying your packaging and you're having to figure out how to manufacture and you're buying your distillate, I think it makes it very difficult to compete on price unless you are someone like a Fernway who's been in the 2 or 3 markets they've been in and has a strong first mover advantage. I mean, I think I was in Boston and it's either the summer of 20 or the summer of 21. I have to check my notes. And Fernway was the only thing that I saw anywhere. I think we did 22 stores in 10 days and like 40 to 50% of the product on shelf was Fernway.
Yeah.
Pretty strong footprint.
Yeah, Kit and his team have done a really good job. I have a lot of respect for him. I think that as those companies mature, I think you find them trying to figure out a way to move upstream in order to get more margin. So as opposed to totally co-man, they'll go to an MSA facility or they'll go to their own sales team or they'll go to their own production facility in a state. I think you'll see that more and more because just the margin compression's too hard.
And I think that model where, I see Fernway as in a few years being able to acquire, if they ever wanted to, their own manufacturing license, their own cultivation license, and further expand their revenue model. I think it would be great for them. And because that's
I don't want to disclose any non-material, non-public information, but I do believe that they have taken a step towards that in New Jersey. Either they have MSA'd a facility in New Jersey or they largely control their facility in New Jersey.
Makes sense. It just seems like the right evolution for their product line, for their customer base, and expanding their brand.
It is one more point there, which is that a lot of the people that I deal with, I mean, I was at dinner in addition to the CEO with the guys from Timeless last night, and a lot of the people that I talk to in the vape space, all the tariff craziness and all the China craziness, if you're in a company where your product is based upon hardware that you don't control that supply chain or that supply chain is offshored into China, you also have another kind of existential business risk in today's environment. And that's not something that a lot of people either talk about or want to hear, but it's true. So I do find a lot of people that are trying to find ways to mitigate that in some significant way.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. How do you evaluate operators or tech platforms as far as their long-term value? If we're talking about these different markets, these different opportunities to expand, your own brand and your business, how do you bring all that kind of full circle as you and your team look to evaluate?
And that's a great question. So I was fortunate enough to come into the industry. Let's timestamp this. I was fortunate enough to be brought into the industry by a guy named Nick Fasano, who was the chief revenue officer at Ease and now is the chief revenue officer at Camp. And he's probably one of the smartest people I've ever met who had a fundamental SaaS background. So the first thing that I normally do is I go to his army and I say, what is this? Because I know about as much about tech platforms as you probably know about, either helicopter rotor blades or AMPK kinase cellular signaling pathways.
I'm an expert on both of those, by the way, Seth.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
So when it comes to tech platforms, man, I'm not the guy. What I tend to normally do is just use common sense and say, is this cost effective? Does it solve a problem? And how good is the data that's coming out of it? One thing for me in cannabis is that there are a couple of hundred different tech platforms that are in like 20 different boxes. And I think like 80% of them have been created only because of the legal requirements of cannabis. And things that are in that 80% aren't that interesting to me because I think if or when the walls fall down, someone else is going to come in and take that over. Like as an example, credit card, anybody who's ever come to me with credit card processing in cannabis, it hasn't worked. It'll work for a period of time and it'll go away. And the minute that the walls come down, Visa and MasterCard will put that up tomorrow, right? So like that's a whole thesis of things where it's like, okay, this is a solution that exists only because of the constraints that we have. There's others that are like that. There were a bunch of people who were out there who were like creating websites for stores. You remember that? We're going to create your website so you can do e-com. Well, isn't that just friggin' Amazon? Can I just do
Right.
that on Etsy by myself? So when it comes to teams, that's a much different story. I think it tends to be multifaceted. I think that for different evolutions of a company's life cycle, I'm looking for different things, from zero to revenue. I think you have to have an extremely passionate CEO who's just focused on nothing but the business, to the disruption and destruction of kind of the rest of their life almost. Once you get to a point where you're beginning to commercialize and you're becoming a real company, I think that takes a different skill set. So, the person that you want to take the first rocket that you're ever going to launch into low Earth orbit or to the moon is probably not the same person that you want to take the rocket from the moon to Jupiter, right? Like just a different kind of human being. I like gray hair. I'll be 55 this year.
Well, you look great. I don't see that gray at all.
Thank you. I tend to like somebody who on the team, not an advisor, somebody on the team who has actually done something before. Not, hey, I base jumped for 4 years, or hey, I was a SaaS sales guy and I decided to do this, or hey, my dad was rich. Yeah, I was a partner at Anderson for 7 years and I've done audit, like something like that. I like that a lot. I don't know.
No, I love that answer. It's a complex question because everything's different, right? Especially when it comes to tech versus operators. Yeah, so I think it makes sense. How are you seeing a crossover between, I guess, pharma, biotech, and cannabis? Or do you see a crossover?
It's a great question. To be honest with you, I consider myself a capitalist first, given the relative amount of success that I had in the monetization of therapeutic drug development companies. I thought I was going to be the guy who was going to pull off something like GW, right? Are you both familiar with GW Pharma and what they did?
I am not.
Okay. So GW Pharma is a company that was founded in the mid 90s. And effectively what they did is they got 2 cannabinoid-based drugs approved, one by the FDA. And they have essentially a GMP facility where they grow cannabis, they extract CBD out of it to a 99.9% purity. And they convinced the US FDA, that drug product was a drug. So that drug is, approved for epilepsy in the United States by the FDA. And that company was bought by Jazz Pharma 3-4 years ago for about $5 billion. So in 2012, I started a company effectively taking a bunch of small molecules that were discovered by Raphael Mechoulam. Do we know who Raphael Mechoulam is? Raphael Mechoulam is the guy who discovered THC as the active ingredient in cannabis. So he is the godfather of weed. And so I went to Mechoulam and I licensed a bunch of molecules from him and I raised $40 million to go do a company in that space and did everything I had ever wanted to do. Did an IPO, was rocking and rolling and just didn't work. Furthermore, nobody really cared. So now, I put that down in 2017 and you're 8 years later and nobody has really advanced the ball that far beyond that. It doesn't seem like the pharmaceutical industry really cares. And it doesn't seem like you have enough fundamental research dollars put into the space to advance anything really clinically. And I also think that the pharmaceutical business model is based upon patents. The amount of prior art that exists surrounding cannabinoid compounds is so extensive that it's very difficult to be able to get a molecule to work in the therapeutic drug development model in a way for them to make enough money to justify developing it. So I think we're in a circular reference if you've ever done an Excel model. We're just kind of like going like this.
Yeah.
Not
Do you, I
moving
mean,
forward.
with the pharmaceutical applications available through cannabis and through cannabinoids, I always thought it's not like it's going to be a giant biotech or pharmaceutical company that is growing cannabis. It's just going to be an active ingredient that they're going to purchase, So do you see like that if cannabis starts mirroring, I guess, regulation pertaining to clinical pathways or trials, and if the feds change or reschedule, do you think that that kind of shift will take place where it will become an active ingredient that, those pharmaceutical companies would potentially leverage, or probably not, right? I mean,
I don't, and I could espouse why I think that.
yeah, please.
Pharmaceutical drug development industry is based upon intellectual property, composition of matter. So if you think about it like we're a locksmith and someone comes to me with a lot like a padlock and you have 70,000 keys, you might have like 6 blanks that fit that lock, right? Of the keys. So that's like a scaffold for a drug, and you can patent that scaffold, right? Or that key. So, the therapeutic drug development model basically says, I'm going to patent this key and I'm going to invest $300 to $500 million to get this key approved because I can then make $1 billion a year for 17 years if I do it right. And I need to do that because I'm doing 15 projects like that, and one of them is going to work. So like 15 times, 15 times $500 million is $15 billion. So basically I'm going to make like $15 billion worth of bets. So one pays me back. And I think because there's such an inability to patent protect what exists in cannabis, they can't spend enough money to charge enough money to make it work for themselves, which is why they bought Jazz. And where I think you're going to see cannabis relegated to in the future is probably 2 areas. More like a nutritional supplement because you have anecdotal beneficial effects, more like a drugstore kind of a product. Hey, here's topical, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But the reason that they're able to charge a premium for those products is because they have exclusivity to sell them. And I just don't know, and I'd love to be proven wrong. I don't know that you have enough white space in the IP landscape to allow pharma to have exclusivity to sell something like that at the level that they need to.
Yeah, that makes sense. And thank you for that. I had no idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's great.
So I guess what unique IP or science driven plays do you see in the space that are being undervalued?
There's a company in Australia right now called Avicho Pharmaceuticals that has a extended release CBD product in a soft gel that they have in a phase 3 with the Australian FDA. It's either for sleep or insomnia. They just signed a partnership with Sandoz, which is effectively Novartis, to develop it if they hit their endpoint. I don't think they're public. I don't know if they're public, but like that's a product that, prior to the Sandoz announcement, like that company couldn't get arrested shoplifting naked at Walmart. And now it's interesting. There's a few like that out there. There's another company in Australia that has a product in phase 2. So I think there's a few that are coming. There's a guy who I've supported intellectually for a long time, whose name is Yossi Tam, who is kind of the heir apparent to Meshulam at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who has a compound which is in obesity that I think is heading into phase 2. Can't remember the name of the company, but there's a few that are out there for sure. Look, I think, Alex, honestly, like because I've seen so much technology, I often tell people, like product doesn't really matter that much, right? It's all about other things. So what do I mean by that? If I look at where the state of technology exists for cannabinoid-based therapeutics, there's enough technology out there that you and I could go today and take a saliva-based test with PCR to take a look at what our genome says about what type of cannabinoid medicine we should use. And there's a company which might be bankrupt that I saw out of Canada a couple of years ago that basically had like a 36 well inkjet printer with all of the extracts that you would potentially want in there. And you would program in your specific thing and it would spit it out as a tincture.
Nice.
So like the technology exists for us today to create a custom formulated tincture that would work with specifically what exists in our kind of individual genome for cannabis for whatever you wanted, for whatever ailment you wanted, right? Whether it was pain or whether it was sleep or whether it was whatever, whether it was comfort, whether it was relaxation. What do we have? We have go to the store and, you know, go to the dispensary and see people that are trying to sell you $10 eighths, right? So you've taken high science and you've kind of, I don't know, put it into a consumer environment because the regulatory landscape it exists, and I think it eventually then devalues or undermines the ability to commercialize high science. I look at a lot of beverages. I had a very long conversation earlier this week with a founder group who is convinced that they have the best tasting beverage of anybody. And you know what? The beverage tastes pretty good. Doesn't matter. The valuation's crazy. Branding stinks. It's super early. They have unrealistic expectations. Doesn't matter what's in the can, right? Does it matter what's in the can? It doesn't matter that much what's in the can. It matters that you get it sold. Did it matter that Jake Paul had a product that sucked? Didn't really matter.
No, sure didn't. Sure didn't. I think because everything's been consumerized in cannabis, it's going to be, I think it's just going to be a slower play in remove pharmaceuticals because I really don't think that's the big long-term play for cannabis. I think it's going to be, and I think it's industrial, 100% industrial hemp and cannabis use, I think will win out and be the driving force worldwide, right? And I think consumerism will always be there for cannabis, but it's a niche market. And I think that most people kind of overlook when they kind of jump into the industry. It is niche, I mean, there's a lot of people that consume, but it's still not the majority of the population consuming. No matter what you do, it's it's not the it's not the phone market. Not everyone's buying cannabis like everyone's buying a cell phone. I think it's just a different market in that world. But you've done extensive work, and you already brought up some Australia and some other places. What does your work look like elsewhere throughout the world between Australia and Israel and Canada and some of the other markets? Like, what are you seeing as a shift? And there's a lot happening around the the international market. So what's kind of your take on that?
I've been more involved internationally in the last 18 months than I have ever been in cannabis.
It's a good time.
Is and note trend, it kind of occurred by accident, right? It wasn't like I was like, this is where things need to go. I met a guy in Israel about 10 years ago at a cannabis conference. We shared a joint together.
That's how it always happens.
And about 6 years later, he calls me and he goes, "Hey, I'm starting a cannabis company in Australia." And I said, "Wonderful. Congratulations." Like that. Thank you. Lo and behold, by 2022, 2023, was the largest or the second largest cannabis company in all of Australia, called Cannatrek. The guy's name is Tommy Hoopert. And at the end of 23, he started to get to the point where he said, "Look, I need help on the international stage and I need to figure out a way to get out of just what I'm doing." And I started consulting for him, and I went on the board at the end of 2024. And I've been on the board of that company fortunately for about a year. And they are, I think, the single largest product company in Australia. It's forced me to go to Canada to understand the supply chain metrics of what we're doing. We import about 12 to 14 metric tons a year into Canada that we sell, into Australia. It's forced me to go to Europe to understand the supply chain metrics. It's forced me to look at some of the facilities in Europe. I was in Copenhagen, Denmark 2 weeks ago in the largest facility there. We had a team in Germany a week after that. So definitely seeing a huge push to growth. Definitely seeing a huge push to the demand side of that market. What you've seen in cannabis in the last 10 years and in the US is kind of a movement from west to east as markets come online and get really hyped and then kind of go like this. It kind of feels like Europe is the newest set of markets that people are chasing. If you look at what happened in Germany, I think they imported 21 metric tons of product into there in the first quarter of this year.
Can I back you up for a second or stop you for a second, Seth? I have a question. So you're talking about these countries that are importing the marijuana, right? Thank you. At this point in time, the USA is not one that can export, correct? So these countries are getting them from Canada, the Denmarks, the Germanys, Australia, right?
Correct.
So I just wanted to make sure I was hearing you clearly on that. So sorry about that. Thank you.
You're okay. No, I mean, again, we'll continue on this theme. Cannabis is still federally illegal in the United States,
Right.
and is for the foreseeable future under your president. So, sorry, under the existing president, till administration, until that changes, which it might change. And so all of this import-export work is either coming out of Canada and into these jurisdictions, so out of Canada into Australia, out of Canada into Europe, or out of a couple of countries in Europe into other countries in Europe. Portugal has a couple of facilities. Macedonia and Greece have a couple of facilities. Denmark has a couple of facilities. That's about it. I keep hearing about Thailand. I haven't yet been there. I'm probably not going. Keep hearing about South America. I don't think of any country in South America, maybe except Brazil, as a large global industrial exporter. I think they did a lot of really good work in cocaine. There wasn't a lot of regulatory oversight there. So I'm just not convinced that legal marijuana is where they're going to win. So we'll see.
Is the U.S. set up like the second that switch gets flipped and it becomes federally legal? Is the U.S. set up to immediately, and maybe specifically California, to start exporting?
Totally. Look, I mean, a lot of the people that I've been talking to, and I'm just going to drop two names of cultivators that I really like in California. There's a young guy in California named Nate Davitt who has a brand called Made. He's out of Sacramento, Mendo, and he's in Arizona. He's ultra premium, high quality indoor. He's got his genetics, and there's one or two different international genetics clearinghouses. Segra is one of them. So he's got his genetics in Segra. He's figured out a way to get him GMP into Macedonia. He's growing kilos in Macedonia and importing them into Germany and started his own brand. So you're seeing it. Another group that not a lot of people talk about, but I really like. It's a private cultivator in California called Headwaters. And Headwaters also has genetics in Segra, manages facilities in multiple different jurisdictions, and has the capacity to get genetics anywhere in the world.
I remember
today.
In my early days of growing cannabis, there was never a time when I was getting seeds from the US, so I think it's super interesting. Dating back 20 years, seeds didn't come from the US. They came from Canada. They came from Europe. And that was the trend. I think it's going to be interesting to see when exporting is enabled in this country, how fast the big cities near the ports are going to start pushing it out, right? So I think about New York, I think about Maryland, I think about Washington, I think
Long
about
Beach,
where you have
California.
Well, I'm thinking primarily East Coast to get it across the pond. I think you're going to see a lot of exports coming out of California, but all the major hubs, you think Florida, you think all these massive shipping containers going over to Europe, they're coming off the East Coast. And so I think you're going to see this kind of interesting shift, and I think it's going to happen in phases, and I could be way wrong, but I think you're going to start seeing interstate commerce happening in kind of a non-traditional way, where the next thing cannabis is going to be moving from the Midwest, the West Coast, over to the East Coast to kind of corner some of those markets, and it'll be coming on a giant 18-wheeler, and then it's just going to have that dropped onto a shipping container out of the port of Florida, and one of them, and it's just going to go straight over. And I think that if you look at the opportunity of exports that come out of the U.S., cannabis could be one of the best ones that could help our economy, in my opinion, right?
I agree. I mean, I'll just go back and loop on 2 points. One, I think, and I don't know what the number is, but a large percentage of the food and the strawberries that are consumed in the United States comes out of the Central Coast of California, full stop, right? So I think as a global number 8 economy, California is largely poised to be an agricultural exporter into the U.S. and the world prima facie. I was at the California State Fair in Sacramento 2 weeks ago. Cannabis is the number 1 cash crop in the state of California. So if we just kind of put 1 and 1 together and make it 3, it's pretty clear that if we're able to export, California is going to be exporting cannabis tomorrow, right? Whether it's domestically or internationally. The other thing we haven't really talked about or touched on is that because I'm in California and because I'm, I think, a responsible steward of capital, I have taken it on my own to understand the black market. The one interesting thing
Critical.
about me, well, the one interesting thing I think that's kind of a secret weapon about me is I could walk into the boardroom of Curaleaf and they're going to take me seriously. And I could walk into the boardroom of Connected and they're going to take me seriously. Right? There aren't a lot of people who can kind of flow on both sides of the street in cannabis. And I'm one of the few. So I took it on myself to look at the black market and to really understand the dynamics of it and the nuances of it. On the black market side of things, if you just look at a pure black market cultivator who's not operating legally in any sense of the capacity, you're already exporting product out of the US, whether it's multi-state or whether it's multi-country. A sophisticated practitioner of the art, you're probably in a WhatsApp or a Telegram or a Signal channel where you can get up to the minute pricing on product anywhere you want it at any grade that you want it. And Alex, it looks like you might be in one of the same threads that I am, and I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. And what's really interesting is when I was in the Virgin Islands, this is, gosh, almost a decade ago now when I was living down there, and cannabis was very hard to come by, right? So everything's getting imported. Now, you can go over to the British Virgin Islands, a hop, skip, and a boat away. You can get over to Puerto Rico. You can find cannabis. There's people growing it, but 90% of it was being imported, and it was all coming from California, all of it. And you think about that, right? Because Key West is right there, right above you. It's so close, but yet all of the cannabis, the entire time I lived there, came from California. And I wish at that time we had a WhatsApp. I wish we had a WhatsApp or a Telegram or some other means, because it was not as, hey, let me get some pricing on this. Let's get some product down. It was not as easy, but it was already established. And, it's, the industry is moving on its own, whether it's being regulated or not, it's moving, and it's moving fast. And so I think you hit the nail on the head. It's already happening. Exports are already happening. It's just when is the government going to reach in and say, hey, now I want my cut? Because that's pretty much what it comes down to. Seth,
Precisely.
do you see a scenario where, regardless of federal changes and scheduling, that states will take it upon, especially neighboring states, will take it upon themselves to basically open up interstate commerce in a way that's not going to, I guess, negatively impact their operations?
I thought it was going to happen towards the end of last year. It felt like California and Arizona, or California and maybe Oregon or Washington, had the capability to do that. We haven't talked a lot about politics. As you can tell, I'm a little bit wary of the state of play in America right now. I don't think it's going to happen at the moment. And I'm not optimistic that unless we see a precipitous change in the composition of Congress, that will happen at the moment. It seems like the decisions that are being made from a federal policy perspective have more to do with the maintaining of political hegemony and power and reputation than they do with real issues. And this is a real issue. And I think it takes a real leader and real leadership on both sides of the aisle to be able to address something like that. And you know what? We don't have real leadership right now at any level.
Yeah, it's very well said. Very well said. Yeah, the political aspect of just our country right now is just so bizarre. And I know that when it comes to, many political issues, whether, regardless of the side of the aisle, cannabis is so low on that totem pole, right? I mean, with everything going on, as loud as we are, we're still, so far low. And I think it's going to take money, quite frankly, to change it all. And, when you look at other recreational consumer products that are allowed, that are accessible, that are federally legal, and the damage they do, they wouldn't even be there if it wasn't for the money. And, I think about alcohol. I think about how much money from alcohol is just being funneled into the government, and a lot to do with exports. You think about how much wine comes out of California. And I think once there's a way to, whether it's at a state level or a federal level, to really monetize it, I think that's when the shifts will start taking place. And hopefully it doesn't take, one or two political changes and office changes in order to get there. But I think that if you look at what's happening on the tribals and you see these dispensaries opening up off of tribal lands, and no recourse taking place. I think it's just a small indication that things are slowly shifting in the right direction. And eventually the states and the companies will come up to an agreement to allow it. Because I thought the same thing, Seth. I thought last year we were kind of seeing that shift. I thought we would have started seeing something, and maybe it'll be Ohio and Michigan, right? I think there's so many neighboring states that have so many benefits to offer one another if they were to open that channel up. So, it's exciting to see how it's going to transition over, I'd say, the next 5 years.
Look, I told you guys I'll be 55 this year. I'm in the game till I'm 62. So I'm here till 2032. That's my horizon. And, if the great moment of inflection occurs between now and 2032, I'm going to be real happy because we're going to do our next interview from my 100-meter super yacht. And I told you I'm a capitalist. And, if not, I'm just going to ride off into the sunset and go make mala beads on the beach in Laguna with my shamanic healer and partner. So who's wonderful, most wonderful
That'll
woman
be
I've
an
ever met.
in-person interview, by the way. That'll be in person.
We can do that. Don't worry. Don't worry. The ship has already been christened Domination, so we're ready.
I love that.
But yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic that someday we're gonna find a politician with a brain, and they're gonna realize that this is a $30 billion industry that's probably gonna be $60 billion in revenue by the time we're at that moment, and figure out a way to regulate it and tax it. There is one thing I will say, Alex, is that I do think, regardless of what happens federally or on an interstate basis, I'm a history major, and one of the fundamental bases of American politics is, this separation between state rights and federal rights. And I do still think, even with a federal normalization regime, whether that's 3 or 1 or whatever happens, there's going to be some places like Idaho and Nebraska where you're never going to be able to legalize cannabis. I just don't see that occurring.
Just like the dry states and the dry counties out there. Absolutely.
So I do think you will see that, but I'm optimistic. I just, the crystal ball is very murky on the timeline of that, because any attempt to prognosticate that I've made has failed, and any hope that I have had has been crushed.
Standard, American dreams just crumbling down. I think it's really interesting because you said it perfect. Regardless of what happens at the federal level, the states and counties are going to make up their own mind. And I think that because you have this lack of FDA approval on so many kind of one-off wannabe cannabis products that get thrown into the market, sold to all consumers, mostly underage, coming out of these one-off unregulated vape shops and things like that. I think, and you're seeing a big shift in Virginia here where people just really want to have understanding of what's happening. And because there's not a clear educational understanding and a differentiating factor being pointed out that these products are not the same as cannabis products, and this kratom is not the same as this sativa cannabis plant over here, and all these one-offs, I think it just muddles the water and just makes things go slower, and it just it's tough to re-educate people and get them to shift their beliefs. Gosh, I can't believe we've almost been talking an hour now. As we start kind of talking and wrapping this up a little bit, what should founders focus on when fundraising in 2025 and next year, whether you're ancillary business or licensed operator? What do you think that focus should be on for someone who's looking for funding?
I think I would probably say 2 things. If you're very early and you've never done it before, if you don't have an operating business, just go to a boxing gym and get punched in the face for a week, because that's how hard it is, right? It's hard. So, I would say if you're very early, just be prepared for a lot of rejection. If you're mature and you have an operating business, the one, I think, most valuable piece of advice that I could give to anybody is talk to a couple people like me and find out where market is for what you're doing. Because I think with a couple of reasonably well-placed conversations, you can get an understanding of like what the box is or the zone is or whatever that is. I tend to find that things that go out that are in the zone of where things are happening have a higher probability of occurring. I find a lot of people who are a standard deviation or 2 standard deviations or 3 standard deviations away from the valuation zone or the financing zone. And I just think that makes it harder. It makes it harder because your process is going to be longer. And it makes it harder because with me, it's just like, I'm just going to think you're full of crap immediately. So it's just like, okay, I've heard the same story 100 times before, and it's hasn't worked 98 times. So like, I'm not going to be convinced that you're going to be one of the 2 outliers. So just stay in the zone. I think is probably find the zone and stay in it. I think it significantly increases your probability of success.
I like the advice of getting punched in the face better. I think that's far more applicable, especially if you're getting on the license operation side. So do you think
Yeah,
that
yeah. Like 2 weeks. Just go get go be like somebody's sparring partner for 2 weeks, and you're going to decide, okay, I either really enjoy this or it sucks.
well, and I think that'll help you, realize that you're going to have a lot of sleepless nights, maybe 1 or 2 concussions will help you keep you up and help you, get a taste for what's coming, because the anxiety and the stress that comes with any kind of in the industry business is just unpredictable. I say it's the best way to look at it.
It is.
So do you think we are past the phase of hype, or do you still think we're deep in it for the industry? Or I guess, is that a market to market?
I think you're past the phase of the initial hype, right? The green wave where this was going to be $100 billion industry and it was going to change the world and it was going to save lives and it was going to help patients and everybody was going to get rich. I think that's gone. I think you're seeing, really hard battles being fought in many states. I think you're seeing a couple of states that from a regulatory perspective have been set up to just function better. Those states tend to favor larger operators and unlimited license modalities. So, I think you're largely past the hype phase. You do see, comets of hype that show up. I talk about one a lot in beverage, hemp beverage and cannabis beverage seems to be super hyped and for good reason. I think everyone is looking for that intersection of here's something that has something to do with our industry and it's going to get bought by a larger industry. And it feels to me like hemp Delta Canna beverage today is one of the few areas where that seems to be realistic.
I think that's due in part to the acceptances in our culture worldwide. It's more acceptable for someone to sit around in a pool drinking a can or drinking a hemp or a THC beverage out of a can versus passing a joint around or eating gummies or.
Well, see, I think it's the stigma of smoke. I think you're exactly right, though. I think it's just the overall acceptance of drinking a product versus smoking a product, right? Like, I love smoking a joint, but not everyone does. And it kind of goes back to that niche component. I think you could probably get over 80% of all adults in the US to try a CBD or cannabis drink versus trying a joint. It's probably going to be 20% of all adults in the US.
In particular, females, I feel. Housewives, moms. I mean, I think there's a larger market for those hoity-toity drinks, whatever the high noons, all that alcoholic crap. Start making the cans cute, start catering them to females. I mean, you can see it. That's where it's going.
There's just a market that's easily marketable, in a consumer product that is tried and true, right? I mean, anyone can sell a can of anything now.
I think there's something else, and I've reinforced the fact that I'm a capitalist, right, and a history major. So I've spent a lot of time studying the historical evolution of the alcohol business in the United States, and specifically the 3-tier system. So you have a 3-tier system of alcohol distribution that was effectively set up by the federal government as it exists now in the 1950s. And it's been almost exactly the same for 80 years. And every single person that exists in the 3-tier system pretty much has, at some level, an exclusive franchise to do something in a specific geography with a specific set of products. And they've been doing it for 80 years. And usually they're doing it in the same family. And you know what they do? They make money. And you know what they want to keep doing? They want to keep making money. So if you're a guy who's a Molson Coors distributor in Minnesota, and you got 75 trucks. You know what you want to do? You want to put anything on those trucks that's going to make you money, whether it's beer or firewood or sunglasses or mosquito repellent, right? And you know what the latest thing to show up that they can make money with is? THC beverages, woo! And everybody likes them, and it's legal, and we can keep the trucks going. So for me, the most interesting thing that has occurred in the industry isn't the fact that it's consumer acceptance. The existing hegemonious infrastructure that exists to distribute these products
Supports that.
has figured out we can distribute it, we can do it legally, and holy shit, people want to buy these things. Because you know what? They're drinking, don't tell anybody they're drinking less beer, Vern. They're drinking less beer. Oh my God, what are we going to do? Well, we better get some of them there, hey, THC beverages, shouldn't we? Right? So, and then you also see it where it counts, which is with the political juice. So the whole thing in beverage flipped for me in the last 9 months, because when I look at what occurred in Missouri and I look at what occurred in Illinois, and now I'm looking what's occurred in Texas, and I look what occurred in Tennessee, what you had was a free-for-all in all those states. And all those states, legislatures stood up and said, we need to regulate this. And in all those states, what did they do? They regulated out the smoke shops, they put in a low-dose exception, and they let THC beverages live. In Illinois, Pritzker started to do his own bill. It got shut down. BevAlc and the alcohol lobby came and said, step into my office. Let's figure out how to unify that. He got his approved. In Tennessee, they put all hemp products under the existing alcohol commission structure for distribution, regulation, and manufacturing. Same thing's going to happen in Texas. There's about 8 states where the same thing is going to happen again. So the most interesting thing to me is that cannabis is an amazing product. The medicinal benefits of it have been elucidated for 5,000 years. Until we get federal legalization, we don't have the power, the money, the lobbying, the unification to get anything done. Alcohol's been there for 80 years, greasing every single one of these guys, greasing every one of their predecessors, able to move policy. So the most interesting thing about the beverage phenomenon is now I'm seeing the real power show up with the money to be able to influence legislation to protect the hegemonious distribution methodology that they have, that they've already proven they can sell product in. That's the gateway to acceptance for me. That's the gateway to Anheuser-Busch, Molson Coors coming in and eventually buying one of these things. Light turned on for me in November, December of last year when those things started to occur. And mark my words, same thing's going to happen in Texas.
Oh, you're already starting to see it. You're already starting to see it in the South. You're already starting to see it in the Southeast. You said it best. They're pushing out these vape shop, these smoke shops, but underlining acceptance of the drinks is being pushed, right? You're seeing it in Georgia.
You want me to get even crazier? Okay. I don't want to disparage anybody, but have you ever been in a smoke and bake shop?
Plenty.
Okay. Is it usually not an English-speaking guy who owns it?
Typically is.
Typically is a guy who might have come here from another country, who's just trying to get his, who figures out a way to get into retail, like a lot of people did in gas stations and mobile phones and credit cards a long time ago. And that's the next thing. So if I'm ABN or if I'm a local union and I say, hey, Mr. Politician, we can give you money and we can continue to do what we've doing, or we could force out this dangerous poison that's being pushed by immigrants and it fits our political agenda, start to connect dots.
100%. You nailed it right on the head. And you see it all over. It's prevalent here in Virginia. It's prevalent in pretty much everywhere stretching down the Southeast where it's not, where cannabis is not locally legal there. You're seeing it everywhere. In Georgia, has 6,200 licensed retail CBD locations. It's just one state, and that's everywhere. And so even if you are this massive conglomerate, let's say you're a Sheetz or you're a Wawa, you're an 11, if you own that retail, you're 100% going to put in that application to be able to sell that retail CBD drink, because why wouldn't you? And I think why wouldn't you? And so I think I love your perspective, Seth, because it's it's so on point when you just kind of peel back the hood and you just look at everything that's happening from a, from 100-foot view. It's pretty apparent at the agendas.
I said the agendas, right? I said something else, which I'll further reiterate. I'm not convinced in cannabis in the value of long-term pure play retail as a business model. There's a couple people in California who do it well. Maybe that's the exception. I could see if we go into this, kind of hypothetical connect the dot conspiracy, everyone's pulling the strings world, which I really don't believe in, but it's easy to articulate. I could see a universe where federally low dose hemp, beverage, and gummy is sold ubiquitously in retail at your state's option, distributed the way that you want it. And flower, concentrate, THC vape, and THC gummy is relegated to the dispensary. I could totally see that world. It's happening in Minnesota. It happened in Tennessee, Texas, and almost every state in the SEC until somebody said, "Holy shit, guys! You're serving 100 milligram THC shots on Beale Street. You might want to think about that, right?"
Yeah, and I think it makes sense, especially if you look at the correlation between many states and how they sell beer versus liquor, right? I mean, in Virginia with the ABC store, I can't go to a grocery store and buy a bottle of liquor. I can get champagne, I can get beer, as long as it's underneath that alcohol percentage threshold. But I have to go to the ABC, the state-run alcohol beverage store, in order to get something that's a 40% bottle of bourbon or, a 150, whatever it might be. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that model. What I would personally like to see is that we get regulation that catches up to these low dose drinks and these low dose gummies that have the same kind of scrutiny for testing. Because I think that is what's critical. And I think it will help push the ball forward from one, a policy standpoint, but also two, just from a consumer educational standpoint. And it will further help remove this black label that the cannabis industry still has. And I think it's once that catches up and the FDA stops kind of just brushing things off. We're not going to do it. We're not going to touch it. We're not going to approve it. We're not going to require certain standardization to testing. Once we can get past that, I'm all for that model because I think it's the best way to go, Seth, where if it's 5%, go get it, and if you want to drink 7,000 of those to get as messed up as you would, like drinking, 24 beers and have that same effect as drinking that bottle of liquor, well, that's on you as a consumer, but at least there's that threshold. And I think it will also further help, the underage component that is, running rampant in certain states. But I think it's all policy made. I think it's all self-inflicted by these terrible decisions that these politicians are making at a local level. But man, we just started touching base on such a good part of the conversation. But, as we really do start wrapping this up, Seth, what advice would you throw out there to anyone looking to get in cannabis and who's just starting? I know you said take that dive into the ring and take some punches, but somebody who's already out there, who's struggling to find capital, who is struggling to expand their business, maybe to get to that vertically integrated spot or that, 1 to 2 MSO spot. What advice would you have for them as they're grinding it out?
I think the very first thing that a lot of people can do and haven't done in cannabis is just make decisions that are profitable. Build to demand, actual demand, not projected or expected demand. I don't know how many facilities you've been in your life, Alex, but let's say it's more than 25.
Mm-hmm.
And there's probably half of them where you're like, God, like, why did you do this? Like,
at least half of them I've said that. Yeah.
So, I think that's one thing if you're operating that you can do. I think the other thing that you can do is, not to advertise for myself, but, get a Sherpa. There's 25 or 30 people on the planet like me, and all of them have their own flavor, just like you would have a candy bar. And people are pretty plugged into market. If you know the right people and you have a specific, here's what I want to do, you can probably figure out with a couple phone calls whether you can get it done or not. And I think, if you're operating and you are in a couple of states, I've been a very loud proponent of just, go and own the states that you're in and get as much operational efficiency and squeeze as much profit out of the states that you're in. Now may or may not be a great time to expand. And I think what we've seen in cannabis over the last couple of years is I got to go get capital because I got to go to another place, or I got to just maximize the value of what you have, because you might be able to extract as much value out of just owning your own customer or vertical or supply chain, or more profit than you can by expansion. And I think a lot of people get caught up in the I need to expand modality. And given the real constraints to capital markets in cannabis right now, I think capital is very scarce, very expensive, and for a very select few. And if you're not in that cohort, it's just going to be hard.
Yeah, that's very well said. I love that advice. And Seth, lastly, how can people get in touch with you if they want to connect with you? What's the best way?
My email is public on LinkedIn and on my website. I have a corporate finance website called CatonAssociates.com. I have a personal branded website at SethYak.com. I have a cannabis consulting website at OrdoVerde.com. I have a tiny LinkedIn presence. Anybody can DM me on LinkedIn. I respond to everybody. I might not give you the response that you want. If I do, I'm up hours in the day for me. It might be the truth that you need. I don't know.
No, I think everyone needs the tough love for sure. A lot of delusional folks entering in this space, with false realities. So, well, Seth, just thank you again for joining us. It was a great conversation. I feel like we could talk for another few hours, but we'll save it for the date on the yacht. Yeah.
You're both invited.
Thank you.
Love that. I'm going to hold you to it.
I will be there.
Seth, again, thank you. James, it was awesome. Thank you as well. And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time as we spotlight more people in innovation pushing the plant forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Seth.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Been great. Yep.